if I could run the internet for a day, I would architect it in a way that heavily judged people for their musical interests. Because I feel like there's a lot of bad music out there, and we could just solve this in a day by having down rating systems for music that I, as Emperor King, decided was not good.
So I think I'm going to delete the playlist that I made for you.
I'm James Mickens. I'm a professor of computer science at Harvard University, and I'm one of the co-directors of both RSM and ASM. I can only pick one, apparently. I think there's a lot of big challenges. I think that one challenge that you see, not just in social media, sort of going across the tech spectrum, is this notion of a very small number of companies having a lot of concentrated power. You certainly see this in social media, but you also see this in search and a variety of other sort of technological domains. And I think that that's problematic for a variety of reasons. First of all, I think it's problematic from the user privacy perspective, because all of your data is sort of stored by a very small number of companies that can sort of see what you do all across that company's ecosystem. I think it's also problematic from the innovation perspective. So I think that when you have a very small number of players dominating markets, that sort of hurts the speed with which new products get made. It makes companies less responsive to users, and just causes a whole sort of knock-on series of problems there. So I think that's a big issue. And then also I think that there are a lot of challenges involving AI in general. And this also sort of cross-cuts different specific verticals. So for example, there's been this theory called the dead internet theory, which has been around for a while, which basically says that most of the content's produced by bots, most of the people you talk to are actually bots. And this was just sort of like a tinfoil hat thing for a long time, you know? Now I think it's real. So now I think it's time to take the tinfoil hat off. So you look on Reddit, you look on X, you look on TikTok, there's increasing and sort of well-founded concern that a lot of the content that's being generated is fake and is designed purely for engagement, but doesn't actually connect you to a real human on the other side. I think that one of the big problems that users currently feel on social media networks is that they don't understand how the content that's on their timeline was actually chosen. And people end up getting frustrated with this because they say things like, why am I not seeing posts from my family or from my friends? Or even if people don't like their family or friends, why do I see this ad? Why is it following me around the internet? Why am I seeing a video from this influencer and not another influencer? So I think transparency, or a lack thereof, is actually one of the big frustrations people have with companies in the social media space. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see people starting to migrate to some of these non-traditional, more decentralized platforms like Blue Sky, that at least, in theory, promise you more control over what you're seeing and more visibility into why you're seeing it. With respect to mechanisms, that's tricky, because I think that if you look over the past, let's say 3 or 4 years, the trend is for these platforms to become less observable. So, various companies are shutting down their APIs that would allow researchers to see what's going on, or they're sort of gatekeeping them behind very high fees, which place those APIs out of the reach of regular people. So I think that observability increasingly will come down to two things. First of all, regulation that might force companies to provide more data, otherwise comply with sort of transparency requests from governments, from researchers, from users. And then also the notion of sort of crowdsourcing data. So taking like-minded users who want to band together and share their data to help researchers understand what's going on. I think that's also another promising approach too, because at the end of the day, fundamentally, the stuff that you see on your own feed, presumably you should have some right about what's done with that stuff. Well, I think a very important aspect of that is making sure that there is good community building between the researchers. So I'm a member of a group called the Coalition for Independent Tech Research. That group tries to act as one of these community building forums where sociologists, public health people, computer scientists, all these types, lawyers, journalists, can come together and talk about what's important. And in some cases, provide solidarity if, for example, one particular project is being attacked by the companies or by politicians or so on and so forth. So I think that community building is actually going to be quite critical as we move into this next phase of sort of technology governance. Because, as I mentioned earlier, there's increasing centralization of the internet and the various technologies that deploy atop of it. And so I think the only way to counterbalance that centralization is to create other power centers, other collections of people who have power through their collective strength. One of the things that I think is great about RSM is that it has provided one of these watering holes. It has provided one of these shared spaces where people who care about social media and really just technology at large can find each other, present their work, can learn from each other, and can just share that sense of community. I think that one of the things that has characterized the past, let's say, 4 or 5 years in the technology industry is that both people on the left, the right, the center, politically speaking, all think something has gone wrong. There's oftentimes disagreement over, what specifically has gone wrong and how to fix it. But people think that the status quo is not tenable. And I think the role of a place like RSM, particularly a place like RSM that's situated in academia, is to encourage that type of critical analysis of technology and to be open to both the possibility that technology has helped society in a large number of ways, but also we don't want to be pure techno-optimists. We don't want to just say, the tech industry will figure it out. We want to actually apply a critical lens so that technology can fulfill its promise without creating a lot of collateral damage upon users or groups or nations or languages that weren't traditionally considered by the tech industry. I think the best way to create technology for the public good is to make sure that the public good is considered at every step of the engineering process, starting from ideation, then going through design, then to implementation, then to deployment, and then to product roll down. I think that a lot of engineers just want to build stuff. And so just like with security, where a lot of engineers think, I'll build it, then I'll make it secure. I think a lot of engineers think, I'll deploy this thing. Once I have users, then I'll make it safe, or some definition of safe. And we now know that doesn't work. And so I think it's critical in both our schools and inside our companies to be educating engineers and making sure that they are actually thinking about the public good at every step of the workflow. I am somewhat surprised that we haven't seen more aggressive disconnections from social media. I think that people feel stuck. People will take a detox for a bit and then realize there's actually content and people that I want to keep up with. And so I think society hasn't quite figured out how to deal with that fraught relationship of how do I keep the parts of social media I like, but then ditch the parts I don't. Well, I think that open source projects provide a really interesting sort of case study here. So with open source projects, everyone can look at the code. And in many of these projects, in theory at least, anyone can contribute stuff there. So I think that when you look at a lot of open source projects, like let's take Linux, for example. Linux has to serve a very large user base. And Linux is open source. And so there are certain parts of the Linux community that are very open to sort of community feedback. But there are other parts of the Linux community where essentially fiefdoms have grown up. So there's a small set of people who own a particular feature and they get very upset when people suggest changes to that. And so I think that open source to me is both sort of like a success story, and it points out to some of the governance challenges. And ultimately, what lies at the heart of your question is governance. How do we take a technological product and allow users to have a say, not just engineers or managers? And that's an open question. AI is everywhere. That's both good and bad. I think that there is sort of a economic question about should AI be everywhere, sort of independent of what benefits AI might have. I think that economic question is largely being driven by shareholders who don't want to miss out on the next big thing. So, I think there were some shareholders who thought that they missed out on mobile. Like there are some shareholders who think that they missed out on search. And I think that there are now a lot of people who are worried that if they don't go AI for everything all the time, 24/7, they're going to miss out on the next big thing. So I think that there are powerful economic reasons driven by fear that are pushing AI into a lot of different products. Now, should that be done? Well, I think the results are currently mixed. I mean, there are some things that AI can do that are quite amazing. So this whole idea, for example, that I can speak in one language and then have my voice speak in a different language in sort of near real time, that's amazing. That used to be sci-fi stuff. I mean, you see this on Star Trek, and you tell your parents, that's amazing. They're like, yeah, in the year 2525, that's when that stuff will be here. Well, it's here. So that stuff is great. But then if you look at let's take LLMs, generative AI, the fact that now we have these models that can generate realistic looking text, realistic looking images. There are a ton of problems there. First of all, what was that model trained on? Were all of the people who gave their data for training, were they even notified? Were they compensated? Do they have any right to the earnings from the model? There's all kinds of really thorny legal, economic, computer science problems there. Furthermore, when models produce output, how is it detectable as model-generated output? And this is a key challenge when trying to understand what authenticity means now on the internet. A big problem that you'll see in a lot of online media now is, let's say you go to some Reddit thread, or you go to some Facebook post about some movie, and then you see people talking about that movie. You don't know if those are actual people or not. And increasingly what you're seeing in these types of threads are people sometimes accusing other folks of being bots. The one commenter will say something that someone else doesn't like, and they'll say, nice comment, bot. And it's not always clear if they mean that just merely as an insult or as an actual existential question. Like you are actually a piece of code running somewhere in a data center. And so these types of problems are really sort of making it difficult to understand what is authenticity on the internet. I mean, I like to think of myself as being pretty savvy from the computer perspective. I got a degree in it, and I'd always used to look at ads. I tell my friends, my parents, oh, that's definitely CGI. That's not real. And now sometimes I look at stuff, and it's actually quite hard to tell. And I think that has a significant impact on the usefulness of the internet in general. There was this, over the past 2 or 3 years, this very popular hack for making Google searches work better, which is you type in your search term, then you add Reddit at the end. And this was a popular hack because the thought was that this would then get you to online discussions that are more likely to be generated by humans. But the utility of that is decreasing as more and more bots and other types of sort of artificial participants join the system. So I think there's a lot of challenges with AI across all different fields. I mean, a final one that I'll mention is just the issue of bias. I think there are a lot of people out there, some of them technical, some not, who think that, if a machine does something, if a program does something, then it must be correct. It must be the right thing because it's just zeros and ones. So how could it suffer from bias or things like that? And that's just not true. And I think at this point we have a lot of evidence to show that models, much like people, are heavily influenced by what they are taught. And so I think there's a really interesting to say, like, challenge that we have, and first of all, educating people to understand that AI is not always correct. Computers in general aren't always correct. And we need to train technologists to understand that when you build these systems, you have to think about who is the intended user base, who do you think your product's for, who are you not thinking that your product is for? They might end up using it too. What are the unintended consequences? And I think things like that really have to become part of the ethos of designing these systems. I think that 5 to 10 years from now, academic labs that want to have an impact on the real world will have to integrate more deeply with industry. Now, by that, I don't necessarily mean they have to take industrial funding. I don't necessarily mean that they have to only hire people from industry. But I think that we are currently in a much different world right now than, let's say, 30, 40 years ago, where the internet wasn't pervasive, everyone didn't have a supercomputer in their pocket, and it was much easier for academics to say, oh, here's some neat idea, and then that idea could just go into the world because there weren't as many established titans of technology. I think now you have a lot of entrenched companies in a variety of different technological sectors, and those companies have embedded a lot of deep technical knowledge into their products. So I think that if you're a regulator, if you're a policymaker, if you're a social scientist who wants to understand and improve how technology works, you have to bring in some expertise from the tech industry to fully address those problems. So the Applied Social Media Lab, in some ways, is very similar to RSM. We want to bring in a set of people who care about making technology work for the public good. The key difference between RSM and ASML is that ASML mostly hires engineers. We bring people in from industry who have experience with building large-scale, complicated pieces of software, and so we want to take that talent and then specifically have them work on technology for the public good. I hope that the legacy for the Institute for Rebooting Social Media is that we sort of served as a great example of the good that can come out when you bring a lot of folks together and then let them marinate. I think that there's sort of this myth in both academia and to some extent industry about this notion of solo work being the best work. That essentially the way that you get the best out of people is to just put them in an office somewhere, give them some peace and quiet, then they'll churn out the next great work. And that's true sometimes, but I think in general the best ideas come out from cross-pollination. They come out from people talking to each other. I'll give you a concrete example of that. What should we do with TikTok, or we as the American government, or we as just society in general? There are so many interesting and diverse opinions about what to do with TikTok. Is it good? Is it bad? How does the algorithm work? What do they owe us in terms of transparency? And I think there have been a lot of really good discussions at RSM that we've helped to facilitate to help people to understand the different facets of this problem. And so that, I hope, is something that everyone who came to RSM took away from RSM. It's really great to put a bunch of people in a room, virtual, real life or otherwise, just have them talk about some of these